Hi there, I'm Tosin. Have you been to Chinatown? You must have heard about the delicious dim sum in Chinatown. But do you know the history of Chinese American? How did the Chinese come to the United States? Chinese people started to immigrate to America about 200 years ago. They came here to look for a better life. That was the time of the gold rush. Many of them worked in the mines, but more of them worked to build the railroads. In the 1850s, there were about 25,000 Chinese in the state. Most of them were from a county named Taishan in Mandarin or Hoisan in local language. In the 1980s, over 60% of the Chinese Americans said that their families were from Hoisan. In 1820, about 300 Chinese immigrants arrived in the United States. That was the time before the gold rush. 28 years later, people discovered gold in California. At the time, the Guangdong province, especially the Hoisan County, encountered political unrest, floods, and famine. This caused people to migrate to America. They first settled down in San Francisco. Later, Chinese immigrants made up 10% of California's population. The Chinese immigrants came here to seek a better life, but what was really waiting for them was the harsh life, and there was something make their life even more difficult. In 1850, California passed a foreign miners tax. The tax was targeting Chinese immigrants. They needed to pay the tax every month. If they didn't pay, they would not have the right to mine. Later, gold supplies decreased. The Chinese moved to other businesses. At the time, the American economy developed rapidly. People needed to transport the crops and raw materials from the West Coast to the East Coast. Also, people living in the West Coast needed the products from the East Coast. Therefore, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad started. All year round, summer and winter, the Chinese were working hard to build the railroad. Many of them died from explosions, landslides, avalanches, and disease. Even though they made major contributions to the railroad, very few people know about their stories. At the beginning of the construction, it was hard to recruit laborers. Later, the Central Pacific Railroad director Charles Crocker recommended hiring Chinese workers, but this plan met with opposition from many people. People thought that the Chinese were not strong enough to do the job. However, the construction schedule was very tight. So in 1864, people began hiring Chinese workers. They hired 21 Chinese men. Later, people realized that Chinese workers were capable for building the railroad. They started to hire more Chinese workers. More Chinese began arriving in California. 2 years later, about 90% of the workers were Chinese. It took 3 weeks for the Chinese to cross the Pacific Ocean. They were originally from a warm place, but they needed to work in cold winters in the States. That was a big challenge for them. Not to mention that they came here alone far from their families. However, they overcame all the difficulties and did the job well. Their job duties included everything: blacksmithing, tunneling, and carpentry. They finished all these works using hand tools. The president of Central Pacific, Leland Stanford, he was also the founder of Stanford University. He said that most of the railroad labor force were Chinese. Without the Chinese, it would be impossible to complete this great national railroad. They did the most difficult and dangerous work. However, their hard work didn't mean that they were well treated or well compensated for their effort. In 1864, the Chinese worked 6 days a week, but they were only paid $26 a month. For the same job, the wages of the Chinese workers were 50% lower than others. They also needed to pay for their own food. Finally, a strike broke out in 1867. Their working conditions improved after the strike. There was a time, if you travel from the East Coast to the West Coast, you could only choose to ride a horse or take a stagecoach. That would cost you a few months. If you chose sailing, you needed to go south to Panama, and then you could go to the other coast. But they all changed on May 10, 1869, in Utah in a ceremony. Leland Stanford hit in a gold spike. The gold spike marked the joining together of the Central Pacific Railroad and Union Pacific Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished. From New York to San Francisco, the railroad made it possible to travel in a train in just a week's time. After the completion of the railroad, the United States was profoundly changed. The environment, commerce, even the concept of time all changed. Over time, the Chinese immigrants decided to stay in America. They had to figure out where to live. Chinatowns appeared. San Francisco's Chinatown is the oldest Chinatown in the state. It dates back in the 1850s. Also in other California cities like San Jose and Los Angeles, they all have Chinatowns with a long history. Chinatowns also started to appear in places like New York City, Boston, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. Chinese immigrants started some small businesses in Chinatowns. They worked very hard to survive. They needed to earn money to send back home. In the late 1800s, Chinese immigrants faced intensifying discriminations. That was the Yellow Peril period. In San Francisco, goods coming out of Chinatown had to be labeled as Chinatown products. Later, 30 ordinances were passed just targeting Chinese laundromats. Violence also broke out in Chinatowns. Despite the violence, many Chinatowns survived. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. The Chinese were officially not welcome. After that, Chinese couldn't come to the United States, and for those living in the States, they could not become American citizens. In 1906, an earthquake occurred in San Francisco. Fires broke out across the city. This earthquake destroyed thousands of homes and businesses in Chinatown. Many Chinese died from the earthquake. After the earthquake, the Chinese immigrants arriving to San Francisco had to be processed at the Immigration Center at Angel Island. Many immigrants were detained in harsh conditions for weeks, months, or even years. They were just waiting and waiting. Finally, some of them were approved, some of them were denied to enter the state. The center was closed in 1940 after it was destroyed by fire, and when the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943, the Chinese communities dominated by men started to shift. Their wives could come to the state. After that, the descendants of Chinese immigrants gradually took root and developed in America. If you want to understand the history of Chinese American, you need to understand two words. The first is Hoi San. When you are walking on the streets of Chinatowns, you could hear the sounds of Hoisanese floating everywhere. Hoisan is a small county-level city in Guangdong province, but people from Hoisan play an important role in American history. The language these people speak is called Hoisanese. There is a degree of mutual intelligibility between Hoisanese and Cantonese, but the vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation have major differences. Hoisanese speakers born in China can usually understand Cantonese, but American-born Hoisanese speakers can typically understand only about 10% of what they hear in Cantonese. Hoisanese was formerly the lingua franca of overseas Chinese in North America. That's probably the Chinese language that most people knew up until the 1980s. As late as 1988, 70% of Chinese Americans claimed that their ancestors were from Hoisan. Another term you need to know is Siyap. Hoisan people also call themselves as Siyap people, and Hoisan dialect is also called the Siyap dialect. Siyap means four counties. Hoisanese is natively spoken in Hoisan and other three counties nearby, Hoi Ping, Kinh Voi, and Yinping. Hoisan people made a significant contribution to North American society, so the Hoisanese speakers are proud of their linguistic and ethnic heritage. They recognize that Hoisanese is special and strive to preserve it. Apart from building railroads in the state, Chinese immigrants also built Canada's Transcontinental Railroad. From 1880 to 1885, 17,000 Chinese men came to build the railway. More than 4,000 Chinese men lost their lives during the construction. All of them remain nameless in the history of Canada. The descendants of the Hoisan people have made great achievements in North America. The first person I want to introduce is Gary Fai Lok. Gary Lok was born in 1950 in Seattle. He's the third generation Chinese American. His paternal grandfather left Hoisan in the 1890s and moved to America. He worked as a houseboy in Washington. Locke attended Yale University and graduated in 1972. In 1999, Locke became the first Chinese American governor in the United States history. Later, Obama nominated Locke to serve as United States ambassador to China. From the house his ancestors worked to the White House where he worked, Locke's family spent almost 100 years to finish this special journey. The second person I want to introduce is Ed Lee. Ed Lee was also born in Seattle. His family was also from Hoisan. His father was a cook and his mother was a seamstress. They raised Lee and his 5 siblings in public housing. Ed Lee studied hard and worked hard. Later, he became the first Asian American mayor of San Francisco. In 2021, the mayor of Antioch, California, made an official apology to the destruction of its Chinatown in 1876 and its mistreatment to the early Chinese immigrants. After gold was discovered in this place, Chinese immigrants came to this city. But many of them faced anti-Chinese sentiment and became scapegoats. During this time, Chinese residents were prohibited from going out after sunset. To commute to their jobs and homes at night, Chinese residents dug secret tunnels between where they work and their homes. One day in 1876, the Chinese residents were told that they had to leave until 3 p.m., no exceptions. After the Chinese residents left, the city's Chinatown was burned to the ground. After Antioch apologized, San Jose also formally apologized for the burning down of its Chinatown in 1872. Later, Denver removed an anti-Chinese plaque. This plaque marked the 1880 destruction of its Chinatown. Hoisan people didn't just build railroads overseas, they also built railroads in their hometown. In 1906, Qin Yihe founded the Senning Railway Company. This was an ambitious attempt. He was trying to modernize his hometown. The old name of Hoisan was the Senning County, so this railroad was named the Senning Railway. The railway was built solely with private capital. He initiated a campaign overseas. The campaign raised $2.7 million for the project. Through family connections, Qin moved to America around 1862. He was a teenager at that time. He learned English and took engineering classes. Later, he worked as labor contractor in Seattle for railroad projects. He made his fortune. Qin returned to his hometown after spending 40 years in America. The money he raised for the railway came primarily from overseas Hoisan people. Qin's goal was to connect Hoisan and other major ports so people could take boats to Hong Kong and then go abroad. The railway would ultimately connect to a large transportation system from Southeast Asia to Europe. After the Hoisan people settled down in America, they would send money back to their home village to build houses for their families. They would also send foreign postcards to local builders. Local builders would create unique designs based on the images from the postcards. Therefore, the houses in Hoisan and counties nearby are a combination of Chinese and Western styles. Some look like European castles. Meanwhile, overseas Hoisan people introduced volleyball to China. In Hoisan, every village has a volleyball court. During the Lunar New Year, everyone plays volleyball to celebrate. In the 1950s, half of the members of the Chinese national volleyball team were from Hoisan. As the saying goes, a good education can change people's destiny. After knowing the importance of modern education, overseas Hoisanese started to donate money to build schools for their children back home. They want them to get a good education. Almost every village has a school in Hoisan. Taishan No. 1 Middle School is the best middle school in Hoisan. It was donated by overseas Chinese and built in 1926. Both businessmen and tricycle drivers donated money to build the school. They wanted their children in their hometown to receive the best modern education. At that time, it was the largest and most advanced county-level middle school in China. This middle school has the largest number of overseas Chinese donors and the largest amount of donations. Because people here value education, their descendants have achieved great success. Let me list a few big stars you definitely know. Donnie Yen is a Hong Kong actor. He's famous for his martial arts films. He portrayed Wing Chun Grandmaster Yip Man in the IP Man film series. His family is from Hoi San. Tony Leung Chiu Wai is a Hong Kong actor. He is one of Asia's most successful and internationally recognized actors. His family is also from Hoi San. There are also many superstars from other counties nearby, the Si Yap region. Andy Lau, Chow Yun Fat. Hoi San people created splendid cultural heritage both in the city and the countryside. However, as time passed by, the owners of these houses moved to foreign countries. These unique and fantastic buildings went empty. After being exposed to the elements, they began to collapse. When I was in primary school, one day I was watching TV. Suddenly, the image of the village in Hoi San popped up. I was fascinated by the unique and beautiful architectures. After that, every time I went to Hoi San, I would visit the old village with historic buildings. To others, these are shabby and abandoned houses, but to me, these are treasures. When I entered college, I started to learn professional knowledge about village revival. Meanwhile, I became the docent of the local museum in my city. I also established various student clubs to preserve and promote traditional cultures, such as the Hakka Association, which aims at preserving and promoting the Hakka cultures, Lion Dance Troupe, the Cantonese Opera Troupe, Southeast Asia Social Practice Project, and so on. You see, I did a lot of work. At the same time, I was also learning more about the history and cultures of overseas Chinese from Hoi San. During the holidays, I took my classmates and teachers to Hoi San to see historical sites. They were all attracted by the old villages and the old towns there. So I decided that I needed to do something to revive this cultural heritage. I want more people to know about Hoi San. After graduation, I spent 2 years driving around Hoi San. My goal was to find a village that was suitable for my project. At the same time, I studied architecture by myself for 2 years. I also watched tons of videos about how to renovate historic buildings on YouTube. After the hard work, finally, I found the village. All the buildings in this village were built in the 1930s. Most of the homeowners were overseas Hoi Sanese in Myanmar. Yeah, there are also a lot of Hoi San people in Southeast Asia. After they made their fortune, they bought the woods and other materials, transported them back to Hoi San, and built these fantastic buildings. There are woods behind the village. The woods can block the typhoon. In front of the village are 2 beautiful lakes. The feng shui of this village is very good. When I first came to this village, the whole village was empty for decades. The weeds there were taller than me. There was a huge duck farm in front of the village. There are 7 historic buildings in this small village. When I opened the door of one of the houses, I saw the life of the family who used to live here about 70 years ago. The dust on the ground was 2 centimeters thick. The furniture in the house fell to the ground in a mess. It was hard to find a comfortable place to stand, not to mention a place to sit. Almost all the windows in this house were broken. Bats and sparrows were flying around the house. There was no tap water, no electricity, of course no Wi-Fi in this house, not to mention the toilet. So I started the renovation. The process was extremely hard, since it was hard to find the workers here as the village was hollowing out. So I did most of the renovation jobs myself. Many times I wanted to give up. I asked my friends, what's the meaning of doing this? It is so hard, no one can help me. I was upset and desperate, but my friends always give me support, so I could always find a way to overcome difficulties. No tap water? I connected the water pipe here from the next village. No toilet? I installed the septic tank and built the bathroom by myself. I replaced all the broken windows by myself too. It took me 6 months to fix all the windows. Then, no more bat or sparrow flying around in the house. Most of the floor tiles were damaged in this house, so I retiled them by myself. Later, my family also came to help me to finish this meaningful project. And my friends also gave me a lot of help. This is definitely an unforgettable experience in my life. I built a drainage system with my family. We together created a happy garden. In the past, it was hard to grow any flowers here. Now it's full of flowers. I also built a vegetable garden, and we start to have geese, ducks, and chickens in this happy wonderland. Finally, After more than 2 years hard work, I finished the renovation of the first building of my project. The whole project's name Tosen's Garden. The day we cooked here for the first time, I was emotional and I cried. I have been waiting for this day for so long. This building now became a restaurant, a guest house, and a cultural center. We have guests from different cities and even different countries. This is a place full of happiness and inspirations. I remember one of my guests told me that before coming to my place, he was extremely upset. He was under great pressure at work and life. But after staying here for a few days and enjoyed the beauty of the countryside, he found that his life was full of hope again. Some students came to visit my place and learn the history of Hoi San. After this unforgettable experience, some of them began to have strong interest about the history of Chinese American. There are many stories like these. I hope everyone who's interested in the Chinese countryside and the history of overseas Chinese can visit Hoi San at my place. It's near Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Visitors can take the high-speed railway to Hoi San at my place. It's very convenient, so why not? Whether you come here to find your roots or you just want to visit Hoi San, experience the life in the countryside, taste the local food, or just make friends with me, this is the place for you. You won't be disappointed. After I finished the renovation of the first building, I started the second. The story continues. A good news! Now in the state of New York, every year, February 12th, it's the Taishanese Heritage Day. People from Hoi San will celebrate the accomplishments of their ancestors on that day. And everyone is welcome to join.